Yeah, this is quite fitting that we're speaking today, actually, because I am. When I finish speaking to you, I'm speaking to Mick Hucknall.
Oh, wow, nostalgia fest. Are you going to ask him about Martine McCutcheon vomiting into his hair?
Well, I wasn't, but now that you've given me a heads
You know,
up,
when he had the locks, he had to. The rumor is he had to have them cut off because she vomited into his hair. I think it was Martine McCutcheon.
yeah, I better check.
But that's exciting.
Yeah, yeah. I think I was trying to. So Fairground is one of my most hated songs ever.
Oh my God, I was literally about to say I love that song. So,
Well, this is it, you see. So me and my wife, we went out the other week and had a few drinks, and I was telling her that I was speaking to Mick Hucknall, and she was like, "Oh, I love that song Fairground," and I just hate that kind of. I hate that kind of. I hate that kind of little rhythmic kind of intro, and
oh
then we
my
and
God.
then we got in because we were a bit pissed, and we put it on, and I had a moment where I briefly decided it might be the best song I've ever heard.
Yeah, it's a real
Uh,
banger.
it is a real banger. It's very strange lyrics though, but I think that's the genius of pop music, isn't it?
Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, as you're about to find out, maybe if we talk about this, I don't really care about lyrics.
interesting.
Well, I that's not true, but like I don't I don't pay them a huge amount of attention, especially from this era, which may be a good thing because obviously a lot of the negativity is based around the songs are sort of meaningless, blah blah blah. But I don't know, not to sound like a muso wanker, but I like the way they make me feel. And I like the sort of melodies and the big moments rather than like what they're singing about.
That is interesting. I think maybe I've just been so I guess as a music writer, I was always so from the very I never really had that thing of like pop wasn't good. Like despite being someone that likes music that often sounds like toddlers being tortured or is really likes really kind of atonal music. From the off, I was maybe it was Smash Hits, maybe it was knowing Peter Robinson, maybe it was I don't know. I always just thought pop was the shit,
Mm.
But um, this book, in many ways, is kind of well, it feels a little bit like you making the case for this music in a sort of critical way.
Yes, I wanted to. So I thought an oral history would be quite funny because oral histories to me are always very, or can be very serious and very heavy and on topics that are quite serious. Or like, the critics love like The Wire or Radiohead or something. So I thought it'd be quite funny if there was an oral history about this period that A hasn't really been talked about for its sort of cultural impact or the impact of the music, and also to allow these people to tell the story. Because from reading smash hits and stuff, they were obviously not asked questions that necessarily like probed into like what was going on behind the scenes, and nor should they necessarily, but I wanted them to now talk about what it was like, especially because they were all late teens, early 20s, had some money, were allowed to sort of go to parties, were going to all these fun things, but also were maybe not having the best of times at all times. So I wanted to have both of those things, and I thought an oral history would be a good way of doing it and a good way to celebrate the amazing songs. Not all of them were amazing, but like there were incredible songs in that period too.
I mean, I guess that we sort of find ourselves at a moment where we are looking back on a lot of things about the music industry that maybe we just accepted as just the way things were, or we didn't even have the insight to think about.
Mm,
Kind of, it's been a very exploitative industry since the get go, and
mm,
I guess there was a slight kind of reticence when I heard about this book, where I was thinking, oh, is this going to be another? Oh, it was a different time kind of
mm.
approach to things. But it feels like you've kind of managed to kind of balance things really, in the sense that
Yeah.
there is a bit of oh, actually, this was a kind of crazy human butchering machine, but also it was a lot of fun in lots of ways.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sort of like I didn't want it to end on like a downer for everyone because in a lot of trajectories for those bands, it did end with them being dropped or ended with sort of horrible splits because that's the nature, I guess, of pop and how quickly it was happening at that time. But also, they were like living away from home. They had some money. They were in nice houses, even though they were sort of paying for those houses. But like they didn't know that. They were just like there were so many magazines, so many photo shoots, so many awards, so many TV shows. It was exhausting. But I think for a lot of them, it was like this is amazing and this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. And pop isn't really like that now. So it was interesting to sort of speak to Claire from Steps and H from Steps, who are sort of doing it again now, about how that sort of camaraderie maybe has gone, or they're not all going to the same shows, they're not passing in the corridors of the BBC studios. So all of those details I wanted to have in there, and for it not to be like all about the sort of mental health side or the kind of negativity, but you have to have that in because that was their sort of lived experience at that time, and now they're sort of able to talk about it a bit more.
Yeah. Was there anyone you spoke to that you felt had been broken by the experience?
I was worried about Sean. I wasn't worried about him after I spoke to him, but I was worried that he might be that I would just be bringing up a lot of sort of heavy stuff. He did have a sort of horrible time towards the end, but he is still in Five, although there's three of them. So he does still perform those songs. He is with two of the band members, and he did say that he sort of never regretted doing it. He sort of was like, I just wasn't able to handle it at that time because I was young and I'm a sort of different person now. So I think everyone sort of had a sort of time away from it to kind of go back and think about what happened, and has sort of come to terms with a lot of what has happened. I mean, Steve Brookstein was treated badly on the X Factor. He was the first winner. He was the sort of guinea pig of that whole thing. And I'm not entirely sure if he's fully forgiven or sort of come to terms with everything that happened.
Right. Yeah.
But at the same time, he sort of is married, has a kid, has a nice life. But, some of the sort of bitterness, I don't know if you could ever sort of fully get rid of.
Yeah, I sort of feel a little bit like, just from my brief interactions with him, that he might be built a little bit like that as well.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, Louis Walsh compared him to a serial killer on This Morning, like while the show was about to reach this sort of climax of like his career peaking by winning this show, and he was being referred to as sort of Fred West.
Cheers.
So there were a lot of awful things that were happening that I think didn't help his sort of mental health at that point. But yeah, I mean, because of the sort of nostalgia cycle and it being sort of 20 years, so many of them were still doing stuff. They were still have PRs, still together, still touring, still playing shows. So I was happy in that sense that I wasn't trying to like dredge up like this sort of past that they hadn't come to terms with or that they weren't happy with, because they're still sort of doing it, a lot of them. And I think that's quite nice.
Yeah, I think that when I've crossed paths with various people who were in the book, that in lots of ways there is, I don't know, almost like a sort of a warm lament for how much fun it was, and almost like they
Yeah.
they don't feel totally like disorientated by the world changing. They were just kind of grateful to be part of something.
Yeah. And I think some of it's like Mucha sort of talked about regretting not really being in the moment, I guess, not to sound like a wanker, but like not sort of enjoying it while it was happening, like having number one albums, winning a Brit Award. I mean, she forgot that they'd won a Brit Award. She got to sort of sing with George Michael. She got to be friends with Amy Winehouse. She toured with Prince. And I don't think at that time, at that age, in the life that she was sort of in at that moment, that she did necessarily appreciate it. So I think them coming back together with that original lineup allows her to sort of have a bit of that again and get her sort of flowers, as it were.
I love that
So
phrase.
that's,
I love that
yeah,
phrase. I love that phrase. Get
it's nice, isn't it?
Well, I always just feel a little bit like, when I get flowers from my mum, she always says I've wasted money because they'll die in a few days. Maybe that's just my mum. It sounds very goth of her, but
No, I love that. And also I do think for people like Mucha, her voice is incredible. And I think there were people who were incredibly talented that got sort of lost in the conveyor belt, and this, that people did assume it was manufactured pop. They dismissed it as this. They weren't really that invested in it. Girls Aloud sort of changed some of that because people could latch on and say, oh, I love Xenomania. I love the fact that they referenced the Smiths, or the Arctic Monkeys have covered one of their songs. And I think now people are like, well, actually, those songs sort of worked because of Girls Aloud rather than like despite them.
So, what do you think changed?
In terms of like people's attitudes to that.
Yeah, well, I think that there was there were people within this era that I think it was a time of great change in lots of ways culturally
Mm,
in Britain that this period that you've written about spans, but also, well, there were certainly people within that world who had found a formula. I think, like any kind of great era of pop, that um, almost like kind of these are the people you work with, these are the
yeah.
TV shows that find people, etc., etc. And then things did change. And what do you think was the end of that era, really?
Well, I guess S Club 7 were I think they were like the peak of that sort of, the sort of same songwriters, the same producers producing this sort of amazingly like crafted pop music, but it was very like aimed at a younger audience, like a children. And, they had the TV show, the two things had to sort of link together. And then you had the TV talent shows, which really just set the sort of like Westlife ballad thing in stone. So that was what pop was then. And Hearsay sort of coming with like a sort of mid-tempo thing that sounded a bit like Never Ever. That was actually a cover of someone else's song, was a bit like, where's the inventiveness? And then you had these sort of weirdos. Like Brian Higgins his aim was to destroy that sound. It was to hate it so much that he could like unpick it and like just burn it, basically. Like that's what he sort of wanted to do. And Richard X was this sort of, who's really into like IDM, intelligent dance music, I think it was, like just doing like electroclash sort of underground. And then he was like, oh, hang on, wouldn't it be fun to combine those two, pop and this sound, together? So you had these like outsiders, I guess. Brian Higgins should have been the biggest producer in the world because he'd done Believe by Cher, but he sort of stopped working to just hone his hatred of like this sound, and then ended up creating this whole new madness with Sugar Babes and Girls Aloud. So I think you did have these rebels that were like so bored of that clean cut, slightly sort of Swedish R&B thing that was happening, the ballads. Just was like, no, like let's try and be like playful, bit weird. Let's do a charity single that's about the casting couch that mentions sort of blowjobs and give it to Rachel Stevens. Like those things just weren't happening before. And I think they came along and actually they courted, or Brian loved the fact that Enemy loved Girls Aloud, the fact that like the Observer Music Monthly loved them. That's who he wanted to love those songs.
Yeah.
He'd grown up on like Depeche Mode and New Order and the sort of pop that critics loved, and I think he wanted that and got that with Girls Aloud.
Well, I was going to say that actually. Do you think that there was something like it always amazes me when I think about smash hits. It always amazes me that that period of pop, like it wasn't necessarily marketed to children or necessarily marketed to young people. Like there was, I don't say old people, but like older people, right? Like it wasn't it wasn't restrained by the age. It wasn't being pitched to a particular age group. Like, do you think that? I always kind of found that quite interesting because I didn't really feel like that was the case during this period.
That it was aimed at children.
Well, no, that I felt that the remit of this music almost became slightly myopic, and kind of at the end, it definitely, as you're saying, with the people you've named, it felt like there was more of an artistry to it, and I think that because of that, it dragged in more kind of musically curious people. Like it was,
Yeah.
like it wasn't surprising to hear someone who liked quote unquote serious music to be talking about all that new Girls Aloud song is a
Yeah.
banger,
Yeah.
But I wonder kind of what almost sociologically that was kind of going on there.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big question. And sometimes I'm not smart enough to answer those things. But
It's
I think
also
you're right. I think
10 as well.
there was this huge surge of it post Spice Girls, but it actually ended quite quickly. I think around the time of the TV talent shows, by 2001. Well, actually, by the time Girls Aloud started, there was only really Girls Aloud, Sugar Babes, and Busted and McFly. Like they were the big ones. Whereas a few years before, you would have had 10 boy bands, girl bands, mixed groups all on the go at one time to sort of hit that Spice Girls boom as quickly as possible. But I think once, the Strokes came along, guitar music had like a revival that was really successful. And I think a lot of labels were like, pop is dead, pop is really struggling outside of these TV talent shows. So it did take something special or something spectacular like the Girls Aloud stuff and the Sugar Babe stuff to really hang on. And Busted were doing something different. They were doing big pop with guitars that they played and that they had like live, sounding instruments on their records. And the lyrics were sort of Blink 182-esque, but slightly like, maybe a bit younger than that, like triple-breasted women. So, they were doing slightly different things. And I think Busted are a sort of good example of pop sort of changing and realizing that actually slight hint of like authenticity or guitar, instrumentation and musicianship is maybe what's needed. And James Bourne and Tom Fletcher from McFly, they wrote loads of number one hits. They were involved in all those songs as songwriters. So there was a shift, and maybe that was the TV talent show side making people aware of the sort of, you needed this voice, you needed musicianship, you needed this sort of extra talent, even though maybe not everyone on that show did, but it did set in stone this like idea of perhaps being authentic. And later we got this like James Arthurs and the sort of Matt Cardles of this world that came through later.
God bless you, Matt Cardle.
Matt Cardle's hat, which I believe was
well, that's really strange, and we don't need to talk about that anymore. There's oh,
sorry,
that takes me right back.
uh,
There's I'm always really interested as well in how the things outside of the remit of, like, I'm always interested in, like, it's a strange period of history that the book spans. I often think about, and I bet you weren't thinking that we would be talking about 9/11 this morning, but I often think about 9/11, and I often think about before and after.
yeah,
And I was God, I was 21, and I always kind of think about how the world felt very different before and the world felt very different after. And I think there was a lot of that in this period of time. And I wonder how much you feel like the world getting more serious, or the world getting more frightening, had to play in the decline of, what really was almost like a kind of an empire for a lot of pop people.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Like, it was something that I wanted to sort of think about in the book. I mean, so much of pop at that was sort of bulletproof in terms of like big things happening, like Princess Diana's sort of death and that kind of stuff. It just felt like pop would sort of, it could just move past it because it was so shiny and sort of happy and clappy. Although interestingly, someone does bring up that the death of Princess Diana did have a big effect because of the Elton John single, and suddenly like the idea of buying a single in a shop was sort of a thing, and they were placed almost like next to the chocolate bars in a supermarket, and so kids learned that you could buy a CD single in a shop with your mum when you went and got like a chocolate bar, and that might be why it allowed sort of Steps and S Club 7 success to sort of thrive. But with 9/11, I mean, I mention it obviously because of Lee Ryan and the sort of blue
Yeah,
issue.
yeah,
But I do think possibly it did have a sort of, whether I don't know whether the sort of guitar bands influx, they came from New York, that sort of thing. I don't know, like if we lean more towards that music when things sort of shift. I don't know.
yeah, yeah. No, I think I've never really been able to work that out myself, to be honest.
Yeah.
Who was I speaking to the other day? I was speaking to someone. I was speaking to John Robb about his goth book,
Mm,
and I was saying, it feels like the news agenda is relentlessly grim. Does that mean that, you think that this will, almost kind of inspire this new generation of people making broody,
mm,
goth music? And he was like, well, it could all go the other way, really.
mm.
And then I often kind of think about periods of British history where there was grimness in the air, and everyone's response to it was to, have a good time. And I can't really work out which way I go, really.
Yeah, and I do think a lot of people went back to this period in lockdown and in during COVID and did think, oh, like wouldn't it be nice to sort of just go back to a time where we think, looking back, that everything was sort of quite rosy and lovely. And that does include 9/11, as if people don't quite sort of think that it disrupted it as much as it maybe did at the time. Or
Yeah.
maybe the sort of ripples of that just took a longer period. I mean, I do think that TV talent shows did, and Big Brother, like reality TV suddenly becoming a thing, and the sort of those two things sort of fusing together, like the way we sort of speak to people, or the way we sort of interacted with people, and how we treated, or we saw people being spoken about in a way that we then sort of continued to do when X Factor was on, or things like that. So those things had a huge impact culturally and then musically as well, because you couldn't have a Xenomania after that, really. You couldn't send Leona Lewis to their studio and expect this weird thing to take a long time to be made. They needed songs, they needed a lot of songs, and they needed them quickly.
What about the way that the music industry and the mechanics of how we listen to music changed? How much of this is, do you think, was to how much of how much do you think that this scene met its end because of the decline of CDs or the emergence of Twitter or
Yeah, I mean, that's why I sort of thought about stopping. That's why I wanted the book to end in 2006. It does slightly go on to 2009, but 2006 almost feels like a completely different period. Like Lily Allen arrived, MySpace, bands were sort of emerging through that. Lily Allen's way of writing and looking at life and singing, everything was different. Like if everything before was generalities and sort of fun, kind of quite surreal things, like hers was like this is real, like this is real life, this is like reality TV in a song and all of that. And so streaming downloads were coming in, that was sort of affecting X Factor winners. You had the Joe McElderry situation with Rage Against the Machine that wouldn't have been able to happen necessarily without that. You could mobilize people to sort of download this song, and you could do it quickly, and you could change his sort of trajectory. So that did have an impact. And then I mention it in the book, but like by the sort of end of X Factor, streaming had sort of killed it, because you can't go from no presence on streaming to being number one a week later like you could with a CD single, because you need to build up, unless the song is absolutely incredible, but those people would have a top 20 hit if they were lucky, rather than like a number one, and then they wouldn't get an album. And you've won this show that promises you money and an album, and the last three winners or two winners didn't get an album out of it. So it was quickly shifting, and you had people not buying. You didn't buy CD singles, which I think is what so many people loved to do. If you were passionate about S Club 7, you would buy every single version of that single, and you would add it to your collection of stuff. And I think that was also slowly going. The merch, the fandom passion was not as, like, you couldn't collect as many things to show that you love someone.
I think the Joe McElderry thing is really interesting actually because it did feel like I mean as cringe as it was. I mean I remember being at that. I went to that Rage Against the Machine show at Finsbury Park because that's the sort of thing I do, and it was very silly. In a kind of there was like a genuine, it was like the Iron Curtain had fallen. It was like there was real celebration that real music had won,
Yeah.
and I thought it was very silly, but it definitely was a real thing. And do you feel like, I mean, maybe you didn't feel it so much because you love this stuff so almost unconditionally, but there was, it did feel like increasingly pop music was genuine, or at least the machine behind it was generating genuine ire in certain
Yeah.
people.
Yeah, totally. And I think Peter Robinson's quote in the book is interesting. It's like, who are you punishing, really? Like, are you punishing Joe McElderry, who hasn't done anything other than like won the show, or are you punishing Simon Cowell? And I think it was a message to Simon Cowell in a way of like, we are quite bored of this now, especially because I think it's tied up with the Christmas number one, which is very British, and it's sort of a thing that has now sort of come back slightly, but people did enjoy thinking about who was going to be Christmas number one. And by that point, it was like, well, it'll be whoever's won the X Factor. And we didn't even know who that person was in November, but we knew that whoever it would be is going to get this sort of goal, I guess, this sort of prize. And I think people were pissed off about that because it was getting quite dull. And also it was a cover. They were always covers. Like at least with the Girls Aloud thing, it was like, oh my God, they've made this original song that doesn't sound like anything else. But that never happened really again. And it's like you're Simon Cowell. You have access to A&Rs, to like producers, to all these people, and yet it's always a sort of not great cover of a sort of quite recent song. I think that Miley Cyrus song was only a few years before The Climb, before he
Yeah,
covered it. And again, that's like, God, it's so there's no like creativity, there's no like thought behind this. But I think it's a bit silly, as you say, to like punish Joe McElderry. And it was Simon Cowell's first wobble. It was the X Factor's first big problem to deal with. But then a year
yeah,
later, they got One Direction. So
yeah. That's interesting, though. I mean, did you One Direction? Actually, I will say this before we continue. I do feel like, regardless of your political persuasions or your sexuality or your gender or any of the things in life that divide us, I do feel like we can all be united in our dislike of Lad Baby for killing the Christmas number one.
yeah, I mean,
I
oh
just
yeah,
think,
that's true. I don't know why I was saying it's all fine now. It's really not, is it? It's like Mariah and then a Lad Baby comes along. I mean, that Mariah song is great, but like the Lad Baby thing is just,
yeah,
please.
I just felt like it was important to know.
I think we should have that on record. Yeah, absolutely.
I,
And
I,
Ed
I,
Sheeran and Elton John getting involved. No, please, no more of that.
One Direction's interesting though. I mean, did you were you almost tempted to extend the window of what you were writing
I
about
just felt
because
like that's a whole book in itself, in a way,
yeah,
One
yeah,
Direction. Because I
yeah,
remember thinking, like I sort of sometimes think now, it's like there'll never be a big culturally like globally massive. I mean, there's obviously BTS and K-pop is huge, but I remember thinking then like there'll never be like another big boy band or another big thing because it just didn't seem like it would happen. And then it just happened out of sort of nowhere. They didn't even win the show, like it was this huge thing that just sort of took off. And I felt like that was something else. So I wanted to stop there.
yeah, yeah. It definitely does feel like another. I mean, can you cut me in on the deal if that is your next book?
Yes, I'll just do a One Direction oral history. But it's interesting to know. I liked their brief sort of cameos. Like I liked the fact that the man, Chris Herbert, who managed Five, said that when he spoke to a sort of high up record executive who went on to work with One Direction later, he was like, we're doing the opposite of what you did with Five. We're trying to like minimize the schedule, the pressure. We're trying to I mean, I don't know how successful that was, but it was interesting that he was like, everything you did with Five in terms of just exhausting them, we're not going to do that now. And I thought at least that speaks to maybe a little bit of like learning from the past.
Was there anyone you wanted to get to for the book that you couldn't get to?
Yeah, there were people that there were some people that I thought would never do it that said yes, and there were other people that I was like, oh, I can't wait to get them, and it just sort of never happened. Like Victoria Beckham got quite close towards the end, but then ran out of time. Rachel Stevens, I got to, but I think the S Club 7 reunion had already been locked in, and I think maybe that's why she couldn't do it. I mean, maybe she just couldn't be asked or didn't want to, but like I feel like we got quite close to that happening. There were other people, like I wanted to have a few more S Club 7 members because there's seven of them, and it just sort of didn't work out. But at the same time, you sometimes get more. I liked speaking to all the songwriters. I like speaking to everyone, but like the songwriters, the directors, the producers, all those people that are sort of around them who sort of saw different things and aren't as like necessarily invested in it anymore could maybe give you a slightly better sort of idea of what it was like and what happened. Like the detail about Greg Muscuac, who directed Who Do You Think You Are, being there when they got told that they were millionaires, like the Spice Girls. I mean, that's amazing. Like, just seeing their reaction and like them bouncing off the walls in that video, you're suddenly like, oh yeah, that's because you change your life. Your life has changed in that moment.
Yeah, well, it's weird. I've had a few interactions with Louis Tomlinson because he's from Doncaster,
Mm.
where I'm from, and I used, weirdly, when I was up in Newcastle, when I lived there for a period of time, I used to live a few doors away from um, Cheryl,
Mm.
and so in Biker and all the way around Biker, it was during the time of the show, and there was signs. The family had distributed posters. Like
Mm.
weirdly enough, they kind of looked like wanted posters from old westerns, but it was like kind of vote for Cheryl, and it was a reminder that this really stuff really did change lives in lots of
Yeah.
ways.
And they weren't all, I think it's important as well that they weren't all drama school. A lot of them weren't really. Like that did come a bit later. Like these people were sort of from all walks of life, all parts of the country. Like, Girls Aloud, most of Girls Aloud are sort of northern, not from London. Steps were sort of from everywhere. Obviously, the Spice Girls were just this sort of melting pot of people from everywhere. And that's what was great. And their lives weren't sort of spectacular beforehand, but they wanted to change them and they did it themselves. So, Steps were essentially kind of weirdly like independent band who were still
Yeah,
working and like on the dole and like funding some of what they were doing. They weren't really signed for a long time. And that's sort of incredible, you know.
forgive this sounding slightly conspiratorial. I am into that kind of thing, and
Okay.
I've been watching quite a lot of documentaries about um, the emergence of nuclear war recently. So I'm going to transplant some of that onto this. Um, Obviously, there's lots of parallels. I
Hmm.
Firstly, do you think this could happen again? And I guess I'm going to back that up with my slightly conspiratorial view is that I think that there are always people within the British music industry who are hovering around in in shadowy corners who are desperate for this to happen again. Like weirdly enough, like watching The Masked Singer, I had the same feelings that maybe I would have done in the early days of X Factor, as in like, oh, actually, there is someone's trying here to kind of create um, frivolous, young, sparkly pop culture.
Hmm. Yeah, like shiny floor Saturday night TV is still a thing for
Yeah,
sure. I mean,
yeah.
it's interesting that it's moved away from the X Factor model or the sort of typical TV talent show model of being, I mean, I don't even know what the Masked Singer is really, but like it's sort of this fun, spectacular sort of nonsense, which I think is maybe what we need, perhaps. And it's a
and
bit like
and
pop
also
stars.
in lots of ways, and I mean this in the most respectful way. Also, a little bit what I consider to be your MO, Michael. Like
I
I,
don't watch it. I think it's like I think it I don't know what it is. I don't know. Like, what am I watching? I'm watching Claire from Steps dressed as a lizard. I like singing, but I don't understand. And then you have those people being like, "Oh my God, is it Paul McCartney?" Or like, "Is it Madonna?" And you're like, No, it isn't." Like, of course it isn't. It's
yeah, yeah,
someone from Coronation Street.
yeah,
So I don't get it. I don't watch it.
yeah,
But I am happy that it exists on a Saturday night in that same sort of slot that those shows did.
yeah,
I just don't know if the X Factor can come back in that way. I don't know. There's a lot to come out, I think, about the X Factor that might not
yeah. I think
mean
so.
that it returns. But I do think that people do want this boom to happen. And I think that's sort of obvious that the record industry does want this sort of big, hugely successful era to return where money was flowing freely. I just don't know. The Spice Girls were like, it's part of a monoculture. Like everyone talked about the Spice Girls, whether you liked it or not. Everyone heard a Spice Girls song. They knew who they were. And I don't know if now you walked around and said, what's the number one single or who's the big new thing? Who are Flow? Like who's Pink Panther? It's like all of this stuff people would, I don't know. I don't think it happens in that way. Even with BTS and K-pop, I still, they're huge, but I don't know if everyone sort of knows who they are.
Yeah. The other thing I was thinking was I did steps for the podcast, and I guess I was kind of like prodding them to tell me a little bit about the darkness of kind of
Mm.
being very aware that that would have existed, and they sort of skirted around it, but they were, they did kind of allude to it, but it was more on the demands on them than anything,
Mm.
and I sort of, I think it was around the time that there was that video that was circulating on Twitter that was just a load of really exhausted female pop stars, um, really gallantly trying to record TikTok videos, and it just was like, God,
Yeah.
it, being a pop star doesn't look very much fun
No. And I was thinking
anymore.
about this the other day. Sorry, please
No,
carry
no,
on.
no, it's fine. I,
I was
I, I
thinking
I
about
think
that.
you're going to say what I was going to ask, actually. So,
Well, I was thinking about that because was it better then or was it worse then? Or is it better now? Is sort of an interesting thing because you're doing so much now on your own. There's so much pressure on you to do it. There's not like that camaraderie. I think at least when Steps were like exhausted, they were in a assembly hall changing room with like the girls from S Club 7 and like Billy Piper, and they were all sort of like, God, isn't this like fucking exhausted? But are you going out later? And I think it was quite fun, even when they were like close to sort of exhaustion. I mean, maybe not fun, but you know what I mean? Like you were all in it together and there was a bit more of a like a thing. And now it's like, Halsey or whoever, like trying to get her single released and only if it goes viral on TikTok. So she sat at home trying to like think of something fun to do on TikTok. Or worse, a sort of 50-year-old man in the label is dictating to a young woman or suggesting sort of bad ideas for TikTok. And it's like, well, no, I'm on TikTok. I know what it is, but I don't want to do this cheesy thing that I need to do to just get my music out there. And is that fun? I don't think that is fun. And it's quite isolating. And there's a lot of solo stuff where you then deal with all of the comments that come. I think at least this period didn't they didn't have to deal with that as much. They could go out and not be noticed or filmed or photographed,
yeah.
could get drunk. Obviously the tabloids and the paparazzi were there, but I just think you didn't necessarily know all the negativity that was coming because you just didn't get to see it, which I think is hugely helpful.
Let's end on something positive. What's your favorite act from this era, and what's your favorite song from this era?
Well, you have to tell me afterwards. I'm going to be really basic, not basic, but like I mean, it just is Girls Aloud. And I know that's such a like, of course it's Girls Aloud. Like I did an interview with The Face and they asked me and I was like, Girls Aloud. And then I was like, God, of course. But actually, I mean, I listen to those songs all the time and I love them. And the Sugar Babes, like Mucha is my favorite voice from this period. So I just love the Sugar Babes. So those two, but at the moment it's Girls Aloud. Favorite song? I think I'm going to go back to Say You'll Be There by the Spice Girls because I loved Wannabe, but it was Say You'll Be There that like for me like really cemented them as sort of great, and I still listen to that song a lot, and I love the video. I love that sort of superhero type video. So that's my answer. What's yours?
I Well, firstly, whenever I see the "Say You Will Be There" video, I always just think, God, that must have been an arduous shoot.
Yeah, quite hot in those outfits.
Crazy,
Yeah,
crazy. No, I think my favourite song. I mean, I'm sure I could think of something I like more if I thought about it. But
yeah,
I love that song "Honey to the Bee" by Billy.
nice. Yeah,
I thought that Billy Piper was an amazing pop star of
yeah.
that moment, and I think I would probably say, I think I would say in a diplomatic way, "Busted," because I've had loads of interactions with Charlie and think that he's one of music's real good guys.
I don't know how
Um,
much time you have, but I'm interested to hear your take on the sort of harangue. In the book, like the editor of the magazine at that time talks about not doing them or McFly, but they did do like Linkin Park, even though the accusations of sort of being put together were similar.
I haven't got to that bit. So who did he speak
Okay,
to?
that's a great question, and my brain is gone. Uh,
Was it Paul
well,
Bronigan
that doesn't ring a bell, actually.
or
Please hold the
Paul
line,
or Paul
caller.
Reese?
Oh, Ashley Bird?
Oh, right, okay, okay. Yeah, well, I guess my view was, I mean, I remember, because I'm quite friendly with like Future Heads. So I remember being up in Newcastle in the flat of the Future Heads, and they're you know, bonkers on harmonies and stuff. And um, I remember kind of sitting around for hours and them just going bonkers about how much they loved Year 3000 and kind of just thinking that song was genius. So there was never any kind of like, oh, this is a
Mm.
silly pop band besmirching the good name of pop punk or whatever. But at the same time, I used to work in a music venue in Newcastle, and we booked Fight Star, and it was right.
Mm.
It was like I think it was almost like their first gig post Charlie leaving Busted. I mean, it was definitely the first or the second, and he came out on stage at like 2 in the morning, and everyone was just tanked up, and someone immediately threw a pint that hit him in the face, and he sort of just shook his head and like launched into the song. And I remember just thinking it was immensely cool and
Yeah.
real and also stupid, but
Yeah.
like music, right? But remember I remember just having like loads of admiration for him, really. And then I
Mm.
did him for when Busted got back together, I did him for Kerrang, and I did put him on the cover, and I went and met him somewhere on Parkway. I went for a few drinks and did this interview, and if anything, he didn't really. I was kind of hoping that he would revisit that era a bit more and about, share some stories about how he's, I don't know, like sort of his fears about his uh, musicality or
Mm.
and he really just wasn't asked. He really was
Yeah.
like, it was almost like he just didn't care anymore. Well, he did care massively, but he just he just didn't. He just saw how silly it all was. Really, he was
Yeah.
like, "Oh, Bus is a lot of fun. Fight Star's a lot of fun. Music, isn't it great?"
Yeah. Oh, well, that's
Um,
good. Because I think
yeah,
Ashley's argument, which I totally understand, was that Busted and McFly were put together at auditions. It was like a fully auditioned act, both of them. And at least with Fight Star, Charlie, if anything, they were a band that were performing together, learning their craft a bit more and not being very good, and then sort of getting a bit better. Plus, he did have to come from being in Busted, which in a way like had put him further down the pecking order rather than up in terms of being in those magazines. So he did do Fight Star. But I thought the Linkin Park thing was sort of interesting in terms of like what is real and what isn't, and who is put together and who isn't, especially because behind the scenes, God knows what happens with all sorts of bands being, people being brought together in a way by a label, but actually still getting on and forming a band. But it's not that different necessarily to an audition.
yeah, but I mean, yeah, totally, yeah. But I think the other thing is as well is even within that world, like Busted were almost. I mean, there were bands that came along in Kerrang's world within kind of 5 6 years that would talk about Busted as like
Yeah,
a
that's amazing, isn't it?
road to Damascus. You know what I mean? It was
Yeah.
like they were like a band that inspired them. And also, if I mean, I've got my book coming at some point.
Mm.
Um, One of the things I found most frustrating, probably about my time at Kerrang, really, was actually walking into a world where I didn't quite realize the architecture of pop music that kind of existed within what British rock music was at that point. A band
Yeah.
like You Me at Six, or I mean, there's loads of bands, but that band kind of are the first ones that come to mind. They
Mm.
were, they did work with people who wrote songs for them, and they were good looking boys that
Yeah.
if you took their instruments out of their hands could maybe be in a boy band. They would hate that if they heard this.
No, but
um
totally, I know what you mean. Like
yeah,
the haircuts and the styling were not that different, like towards the end. And I think Busted and McFly did have a big part to play in that.
yeah. And
Um,
but like weirdly, I'm not even sure if you go back to like, if you go back to kind of hair metal in the 80s, I'm not
mm.
sure it was that different either. So you know
No, that's true. I mean, John
yeah,
Bon Jovi is, you know,
exactly,
he is a
exactly.
good-looking guy that could be in a boy band or a film star or whatever.
Yeah, what was that? I can't remember what he never really quite escaped it, but there was that quote when someone asked him why did he get into music, and it was definitely a
Yeah.
for the girls. I mean, it
Yeah.
was
Not for the artistry.
no, not at all, not at all. I better go check my Excel spreadsheet of what women Mick Hucknall has dated.
Oh my goodness, please.
It's a big Excel
Oh
document.
yes, wasn't
Uh,
yeah? He did do an interview about the number, I think.
did you? Right,
Yeah, I
okay.
think Rob Fitzpatrick did it because it went everywhere, and he said it was like 3,000 or something.
Oh, I wonder if I can. I wonder if I can email Rob
I'm sure he
Fitzpatrick.
loves to talk about that still.
Yeah, I haven't
He has
listened to it
he
though.
has a beautiful voice.
He does a. I
He
do, yeah,
has a-
yeah. No, we're agreed on that. We've agreed on lots of things
Okay,
this
great.
morning.
Yeah, no, I thought this would be. I mean, I didn't at all, but I'm glad that we're on the same page.
Yeah, totally. Feel free to manufacture some drama at the end that maybe we weren't going to agree.
Yeah,
What's the books? Remind me of the date. Is it what is
30th
it
of
out?
March,
Okay.
next Thursday. Although people are receiving their copies already, so it's really freaking me out.
I think it's going to be stupidly popular. You know,
I know. I
don't know why.
feel.
I don't know why I said that. I don't know why I said that so with such resignation. I think it's going to be really successful.
Thank you. I don't know. I'm coming to terms with it. I'm trying to like enjoy it
Yeah, no,
while
good.
it's happening because
Yeah.
it might not happen again. So yes, I'm excited.
Well, I'm coming to
Oh, you
the
are on the
yeah
28th.
yeah.
Great.
I'll buy you a Bacardi Breezer.
Oh yes. Oh yeah. I did want like Hooch to sponsor something, but I don't know if they're still around.
Well,
So
I've I've got a story about Hooch, but I'll tell you that when I see you.
okay, great. Over some Hooches. Okay. Well, enjoy McHucknall.
So nice to speak to you, man. All right,
What a
speak to you soon.
comeback, Michael Cragg and McHucknall. Okay. Take care.
Speak to you soon, man. Bye, bye,
Bye.
bye.